everybody. How are you doing? Thanks for joining this little session. I'd love to start with a question for you. Raise your hand if you genuinely care about providing equal opportunity employment to neurodiverse individuals. Put up your hand. Everybody. Okay. So why then, if we all care about it so much, are fewer than 1 in 7 adults living in the UK with an ASD diagnosis currently unemployed? There appears to be a chasm between our aspirations and the lived reality of neurodivergent individuals and the employment opportunities available to them. So what is going wrong? In this session, we'll dive into that topic. It will be, I hope, an interesting session and at times an appropriately challenging one, because if we're going to get serious about removing bias, about empowering neurodiverse individuals in employment opportunities, we have to understand the root causes of the issues and how we can address them meaningfully. So as we go through the session, I'll offer a very quick intro to Neurosight and myself, no more than 1 minute, I promise. This won't be the Neurosight hard sell. And we'll then dive into bias and adverse impact. We're going to talk about bias actually from a broader perspective initially. We're going to talk about bias aligned to gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and then we'll bring it all round to neurodiversity as well, because many of the drivers of bias for minority demographics also apply to neurodivergent individuals. And we'll conclude by deep diving into how we could potentially fix those causes of bias, and I'll end with some case studies and data and action points. So, quick intro then. I'm Jamie, founder of Neurosight. For the last 16 years, I've been specializing in assessment and selection, and I've partnered in that time with over a third of the UK's top 100 employers designing end-to-end assessment and selection processes. Now, what that experience offered me throughout that time was a really deep insight into how those processes worked, and I had access to the data that showed where the specific causes of biases were throughout those end-to-end processes from application to offer. Partly because of that experience, and partly because I saw time and time again that conventional hiring processes did discriminate against all kinds of minority demographics, Neurosight was founded in 2019. And what we do is we combine advances in neuroscience with artificial intelligence to create online psychometric tests that measure talent and potential in a way that eliminates bias. I'll reveal a little bit more about how we do that later, but I don't want this to be the Neurosight hard sell. That's not what you're here for. Let's dive into the topic at hand. So, bias. Here's a broadly accepted definition. No arguments here. A systematic tendency to favor or disfavor certain groups, resulting in discrimination. Raise your hand if you've heard the term adverse impact. Keep your hand up if you understand the definition of that term and the 4/5 rule. One person. All right. So it's useful to understand this term because when we talk about bias in assessment and selection, we often anchor it around the term adverse impact. So if you ever hear that term, this is what it means. There's something called a 4/5 rule. And what it basically says is that if the selection rate for a minority group is less than 80% of the selection rate for the majority group, that's adverse impact. It was defined in the United States in the 1970s, and it's since been adopted globally as a standard for measuring bias. And it's useful to know that because I'm going to oscillate between the terms bias and adverse impact as we go through this talk, so it's helpful to anchor ourselves around some common language. But if you ever hear that term, that's what it refers to. Some people, by the way, and this is a whole other debate, would suggest it's insufficiently ambitious because there is quite a large disparity. If the selection rate for the minority group is at 81% of the majority group, then technically that means there's no adverse impact. So I and many others argue it's insufficiently ambitious, but that's a whole other debate. But that's what it means. So when it comes then to bias in assessment and selection, it does exist, of course, across the end-to-end process, but let's break it down a little bit. So thinking about application and CV screening, it's common. Right? People can look at a CV, look at where people were born, look at the country they came from, look at their name, and so on. That kind of bias, when I speak to employers, they feel reasonably empowered to fix that. You can take certain mitigating steps. You can anonymize CVs, anonymize applications. You can provide coaching and support to your hiring managers. And that does help mitigate some of that initial bias at the early stages. Then when it comes to moving on from the application to online tests and psychometrics, adverse impact and bias is very common, aligned not just to neurodiverse individuals, but also to BAME individuals, to those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, to female applicants. And it's extremely hard to fix because you as an employer, unless you develop your own psychometric tests, you're not in control of that. You are reliant on the test provider to get it right. And if they don't get it right, and many of them don't, then that leaves you in the position where you're using an assessment that's generating adverse impact, and there's almost nothing you can do about it, particularly if you've embedded it in, say, a volume hiring process, and you need that test to screen out large numbers of people. And that's where the adverse impact can really kick in. When it comes to interviews and assessment exercises, adverse impact and bias is also common, but it's a bit easier to fix. You can take certain mitigating steps as an employer. When I speak to employers and help them with these kind of issues, they often say to me, well, I feel like I have a sense of control when it comes to things like how we're interviewing, giving unconscious bias training, and so on. Just out of interest, I'm going to ask you to put up your hand if, based on the data that we can see, you think which of these causes the most significant amount of adverse impact or bias or negative outcomes for neurodivergent individuals. Put your hand up if you think it's the application stage that would do that. Okay, a couple of you. And now put your hand up if you think it's the testing stage. Okay, more. And how about the interview stage? Okay, quite close there between testing and interview. It's actually the psychometric testing stage. And the reason for that is the sheer volume at which those tests are used. If you think about big recruitment processes in large organizations, a single organization may administer millions of those tests. So the scale of the impact is really significant when it goes wrong. Let's talk about laying the foundations for success. I'm going to talk specifically, because it's such a major challenge for employers, we are going to deep dive a bit into the causes of bias in psychometric testing and what can be done to fix it. But before we get to that, I'd love us just to talk through some of the foundations that are required for success in any hiring process if you really care about bias and adverse impact. And the first is to be clear about what you're measuring. Now that sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but it's surprising how many employers I speak to and they say to me, oh, we'd love a hiring process that does this, we want a group exercise, we want this test. And when I say to them, okay, what do you want those things to measure it and why, then sometimes they're uncertain. They're putting the cart before the horse. So asking and answering that question, what are you going to measure and why are you measuring it, is critically important if we're going to help eliminate bias. Because through asking and answering those questions, through an activity like job analysis or success analysis, where you identify the success drivers you want to measure in a hiring process, that gives you the foundation, the starting point for building a robust end-to-end process, because you know what you want to measure. And you can design structured interviews, tests, or exercises that measure those success drivers. Otherwise, what happens? It's carte blanche. People do what they want, right? So what happens when line managers do what they want in an interview? Not great outcomes. It's often a 50-50 roll of the dice, where they make a good hire or a bad hire. But that's a quality of hire question. It's also a prime opportunity for bias to creep in. And for people to hire those they like, not hire those they dislike. And thinking about neurodiversity and how some neurodivergent individuals can present in an interview, you could understand how that would be a major issue. And that leads to the second point around laying the successful foundations, which is where you can use structured motivational and behavioral interviews. Define your success drivers. It might be things like collaboration, resilience, learning agility, and so on. Great, you've nailed that down. So build an interview that measures that and deliver it consistently and fairly using robust scoring that's transparent and accountable for every single candidate. And then you'll be able to make hiring decisions. Your line managers will be able to make hiring decisions based on those criteria and with the appropriate support and training. And of course, that training is really helpful. None of us are born knowing how to conduct a structured interview or knowing how to manage reasonable adjustments for neurodivergent individuals. That does require expertise. And even if you've been in talent acquisition for decades, if you haven't been through that process of upskilling yourself, it's still worth doing, right? Even if you're really experienced in the field. Let's talk then about probably the greatest challenge, both from an impact perspective and from a complexity perspective, which is how can we address the causes of bias in online tests and psychometrics. I spoke recently to a global RPO provider who worked with well over 1,000 organizations globally. And their assessment lead said to me, and this is a quote, time and again, we see diversity outcomes decimated by online assessments. Something has to be done. And this is a known issue, and it's been a known issue in psychometric testing for decades. When I designed my first psychometric test back in 2008, and we validated it, we found adverse impact aligned to socioeconomic status, ethnicity, disability, and gender. And that's not at all common. So why is it happening? Why do verbal reasoning tests discriminate against BME and neurodiverse candidates? Why do numerical tests discriminate against female and neurodiverse candidates? Why does situational judgment tests, to give you a few examples, discriminate against those from low socioeconomic backgrounds, BME candidates, and neurodiverse individuals? Indeed, there's a court ruling that states you can't screen out candidates with an ASD diagnosis using an SJT, which many people don't know about. Let's examine the causes of bias in each of these, and you'll notice a common theme here, which is that neurodiverse candidates are being discriminated against with all kinds of testing. So let's begin with verbal reasoning. We're going to talk about BME applicants, and I'll link it back to neurodiversity in a moment. So a verbal reasoning test always contains cultural and language biases. They're generally put together, these tests, by people like me, right? White, middle class, quite high levels of verbal reasoning. I have a certain set of life experiences and biases that goes into my test design. I can't really help it. And if you look at the psychometric testing providers, they're full of people like me. So the very tests that are created and the language that they use may be biased because they can't accommodate things like regional dialects. To give you an example, African-American vernacular English is frequently spoken in the United States among BME applicants, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. It is a perfectly valid way of speaking, right? Because people use that dialect, it does not mean they're not suitable for the job they're applying for or that they're stupid, right? And yet they would fail a conventional numerical reasoning test, despite that's nothing to do with their ability to do the job or their intellect. There are also socioeconomic factors. If you go to a good school or you have supportive parents, you can go into that test prepared and feeling confident, and that really matters. There's lots of research that shows that anxiety reduces performance, not just in these tests, but also in educational tests, in interviews, in assessment centers. And who are the individuals most likely to have that bias? What the data shows us is it's the minority groups, the people going in with that stereotype threat, conscious of negative stereotypes about their demographic. I'm not good enough. There'll be people better than me. People like me don't get jobs like this, right? If that's weighing on you, it's going to impact your performance through the end-to-end process. And that applies to many minority demographics, including neurodivergent individuals. Again, with numerical reasoning tests from female applicants, we consistently see underperformance from female applicants. Does it mean that in the workplace, they're unable to excel in analytical roles? No, not at all. When you look at performance data, including in the accountancy firms, female employees outperform male employees, and yet they do worse in the online tests used to select for those positions, right? So clearly these tests are not fit for purpose if they're discriminating against a demographic that actually outperforms the other demographic in role. Now, that's partly to do with things like stereotype threat, right? Going into the test, not having the same educational encouragement. Male individuals at school, even today, are still encouraged to go into professions like engineering and accountancy and so on. That is improving, but it still leads to that heightened test anxiety. And there is a gender difference between the experienced anxiety in a test environment. Part of the reason for that is females self-rate themselves as higher in conscientiousness than males. In other words, they really care about what they're doing. And if you care a lot about what you're doing, that can raise your anxiety because you place a lot of importance on the success and the outcomes. And when it comes to situational judgment tests, scenario-based assessments, very common in volume and early careers, the unfamiliar work context presented, because they present scenarios like, imagine this happens at work, what would you do? Well, what if you've never worked? What if you're long-term unemployed? What if you don't have the coaching and support of a good school? Or what if your parents have never worked in the corporate sector and they can't help you? These tests are often administered in an unsupervised setting, not uncommon for people's parents to sit with them, if you're talking about early careers, apprenticeships and graduate roles, and help them complete the test. Hardly any surprise then that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to underperform. So that lack of resources and support elevates the anxiety, and in comes in stereotype threat again. I'm not good enough. I won't get a job like this. There'll be better applicants. This isn't a job for people like me. And neurodiverse candidates, the demographics we've just mentioned get the short end of the stick, but my goodness, so do neurodiverse candidates. Neurodiverse candidates are disadvantaged in psychometric tests by one-size-fits-all scoring algorithms, and even worse, something called norm groups. Have you heard of the phrase norm group? Put your hand up if you have. Yeah. So a norm group is, and just think about this from a neurodiversity perspective, what I'm about to describe. When many of these tests are built, they put several thousand people through them, the vast majority neurotypical, and they create what's called a norm group. When you complete the test, you're compared to all those people and a score is generated. What if you're not normal? What if you sit outside the norm? What if your way of thinking, what if your way of expressing decision confidence is different because you're neurodivergent? It's clearly an absurd situation that a neurodivergent individual is held and measured by the same yardstick as someone who's neurotypical and measured against a norm group that's majority neurotypical. No wonder they're disadvantaged. It's absurd. So when you combine that with the heightened test anxiety that those living with a diagnosis may enter the test with, it's no wonder that neurodivergent individuals consistently underperform in these online psychometric tests because of the way they're fundamentally constructed. And the common thread in all of this is heightened anxiety. We don't talk about it enough in assessment and selection. It's a pernicious influence. Think about those moments in your life, and we've all had them, where your mouth goes dry, your hands shake, your stomach shrinks. And imagine trying to do a high-stakes test or an interview or an assessment center with that happening, right? No wonder people underperform. And let's recognize the problem and talk about it a bit more, because it isn't mentioned, I don't think, nearly enough in assessment and selection, and it is a cause of a lot of this bias. There are alternative assessment methods that you can use, and we'll talk about some of those in a moment. And an innovation that we've been pioneering in the field of psychometric testing is that we've scrapped one-size-fits-all scoring algorithms, and we've created a dynamically adaptive algorithm that measures not just the answers, but how people are getting to their answers. And it can identify moments of heightened anxiety and adjust dynamically in response. So there is innovation. I think the title of this talk on the board mentioned AI, and we will get to that, I promise you. I haven't mentioned it so far. But how we fix bias and empower neurodiversity in psychometric assessments is pretty straightforward. We end the use of norm groups. They're not fit for purpose. They should not be used. We start using scoring algorithms. We don't use scoring algorithms trained on large data sets, right, which are majority neurotypical. And we lean instead into dynamic algorithms powered by artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence gets a bad rap when it comes to EDI and diversity, but actually used in the right way, as I'll share, it can be a really powerful ally in leveling the playing field. And this is how we do it, and it's very effective, as I'll show you. So when people are going through one of our psychometric tests, we're analyzing in real time all kinds of data. So their reaction times, how they're moving with their cursor or their touch screen, how they're responding to each of the items. And that will change depending on how you're feeling in that moment, how you express your decision confidence. So we use AI, a form of machine learning, to feed all that data through the algorithm so that the candidate trains their own personal scoring algorithm. We don't impose a one-size-fits-all scoring algorithm. And the result of that is that we're able to remove the adverse impact, accommodate different thinking styles, and accommodate heightened anxiety. And this approach enabled us to win the Institute of Student Employers Commitment to Diversity Award, which we were particularly happy with last year. And I'm going to share with you a case study for a major professional services firm. This took place last year, and we completed the analysis and all the data earlier this year, so it's quite new. But their previous conventional test led to significant bias aligned to minority groups, which I'll share with you. It was generating adverse impact and unfavorable outcomes aligned to gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, and neurodiversity. It used one-size-fits-all algorithms common in many online tests. And so we built a new test that measured the same things. It measured the same success drivers, and that's important. The difference is that we used adaptive algorithms that accommodated the individual and their thinking style and their anxiety level. And this was the impact year on year. This is a sample, by the way, of 12,000 candidates. So for female candidates, the pass rate increased by 30% year on year. For BME candidates, it increased by 64% year on year. Those from the lower socioeconomic status, it increased by 79%, and neurodiverse individuals by 87%. And that, by any measure, is an eye-opening outcome. And it happened not because we made the test easier, it measured the same success drivers, but because we made it fairer. And it was a truer representation of their ability. And if I can leave you with a few action points. The first is, if you're really serious about eliminating bias, I'd encourage you to develop a joined-up strategy, because when you look at an end-to-end hiring process, it's only as strong as the weakest link within it. So if you are using unstructured interviews, or if your hiring managers aren't fully trained and supported, if you're using a conventional psychometric test of some kind, then that will drive the adverse impact in your hiring process. So it's important to look holistically. The second is, I'd encourage you to be bold, right? And to go big with your aspirations. Don't tinker around the edges. If you genuinely, we all put our hand up at the start of this talk and said we genuinely cared about equal opportunity in employment. And I believe you, because, why wouldn't you, right? We're all decent human beings. So convert that desire, that aspiration into meaningful action, and be prepared to go bold. You may have to constructively challenge stakeholders. You may have to do things differently. More than likely you will. But if you set the goal of eliminating bias, not just tinker around at the edges, that would be a great place to be. And finally, I'm a bit biased here because we develop really innovative online assessments, but lean into innovation. And we're positioned, we've got a stand just by the main stage. You'll see it's bright neon colors. If this has piqued your interest, if it's resonated with you in some way, come chat to us. We'd love to talk with you. For now, thank you very much.